Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 139, The Comedy of Errors, Hand in Hand, Not One Before the Other. Last time, Two Gentlemen of Verona gave us a look at the second comedy from Shakespeare's early phase as a playwright. As you heard, certain elements in the plotting of the play and the execution of its denouement make it problematic, but nevertheless it showed early promise. The lyrical nature of much of the language used in the play is quite typical of the earliest comedies, and it is probably not coincidental that this was around the time that Shakespeare was writing his long lyrical poem Venus and Adonis. So we might assume that his mindset at the time was that of a lyrical poet. And maybe we see that influence still in his next probable work, the much more accomplished play The Comedy of Errors, which has remained one of the most popular Shakespeare comedies since its first performance. The comic thrust of the play concerns two sets of twins who, through some quite fantastical circumstances, end up in the same town, Ephesus, at the same time, yet are completely unaware of each other until the last moments of the play. The comedy is therefore one of mistaken identity, and it is contrived by the audience being in the know about the situation that the characters are oblivious of. This use of twins as a plot device is one that Shakespeare would return to again in Pericles and arguably most successfully in Twelfth Night. But it was not a device of his own creation. Shakespeare's source is a play by Roman playwright Plautus, Menachmi, or the Menachmus brothers. There was a published English edition of the Roman play in circulation by 1595, but there is good evidence that schoolboys were being trained in Latin by reading Plautus, so there's every reason to suppose that Shakespeare was already familiar with the play long before that translation became available, as many of his audience would also have been. However, that translation by William Warner was dedicated to Lord Hudson, the patron of the Lord Chamberlain's men, so it's also quite possible that Shakespeare could have had sight of a pre-publication manuscript of the translation and spotted, or was reminded, of the comedy gold that Plautus had created. Shakespeare's innovation over Plautus's original was to double the complexity of the play by doubling the number of twins caught up in the confusion. So we have a set of twins as servants to masters who are also twins. Plautus was further plundered for the scene where a wife entertains her husband's twin while shutting her spouse out of the house. That came from his play Amphitrio. The Comedy of Errors has a framing device which does not appear in Plautus, with the story of the separation of Aegeon, Amelia and their children. This element is based on the Greek romance of Apollonius of Tyre. Another Shakespeare innovation was to reset the play in Ephesus rather than the original Epidamnus. The purpose here seems to be to signal and support many references in the text to St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, which centres on the obligations and constraints of marriage. As I've noted before, Shakespeare knew his Bible well, and, not unreasonably, expected his audience to do so as well. The text of the play comes to us through the first folio of 1623, with no earlier quarto editions available, which makes accurate dating difficult. The text includes references to the Wars of Succession in France, which would date it to no earlier than 1589, but possibly as late as 1594. The scholarly consensus settles on about 1594 because of a reference to a Christmas production that year at the Inns of Court, where a member of the audience recorded that he had seen a comedy of errors, like Plautus, his Menachmus, was played by the players. As there is no surviving reference to another version of Plautus's play, it is accepted that this refers to Shakespeare's. For the fuller version and further explanation of that quote and its context, pop back to episode 122, that's season 6, episode 9. It was a wild night at the Inns of Court, which became known as the Night of Errors. There is also a record of one other performance in Shakespeare's lifetime when it was shown at the court for James I as part of the 1604 Christmas celebrations. As reproduced in the first folio, the play is noted for inconsistent speech prefixes and some unnecessary details in the stage directions, which suggests to some scholars that this play was rescued from Shakespeare's foul papers. That term is used broadly to mean anything from a playwright's early draft through to the final handwritten copy, from which the printed version was derived. That last stage could have been a very fair copy, but very few examples of foul papers survive from Elizabethan and Jacobean periods, and there's no reason to suppose that there was a standard format and method for transcribing used by all the playwrights. The best evidence we have from the period is a sheet in the Folger Library, with lines from Marlowe's The Massacre of Paris, a play dated to 1593, which some consider to be foul papers. So here we might be seeing Marlowe's very own hand. But we have nothing like that for Shakespeare. There is also a slightly later reference from 1613, when in a letter to Philip Henslowe, playwright Robert Darbourne says, "I sent you the foul sheet and the fair I was writing," suggesting that Darbourne wrote out a fair copy from his own drafts, but presumably others would have used scribes for that job. How Hemmings and Condell went about collecting the foul papers when collating the first folio isn't known, but there are theories about what Anne Shakespeare may have had in her possession at New Place, and what might have survived the fire at the Globe, and was therefore still in the possession of the King's men. From the stage directions in the text, we also get some clues about the concept of the original staging of the play. Characters enter from three houses: the Phoenix, the Porcupine, and the Priory. The convention of a set with three doors at the rear and most of the action taking place as scenes in the street in front of them dates back to Roman times and was particularly maintained in the Elizabethan period in plays written for indoor performance. So, at this point, for court performances and at the Inns of Court in London, or in the great halls and houses belonging to local gentry, or in civic halls if the players were on tour. It seems that not only was Shakespeare borrowing his storyline from Plautus, but that he was consciously using the Roman style of presentation too. The three doors at the rear of the stage were, we think, labelled appropriately, so that the houses they represented were obvious to the audience. As there's a good chance that you are familiar with the plot and have seen the play, I'll just give a very briefest of summaries here as a reminder. Merchant Aegean from Syracuse has been caught illegally trading in Ephesus and faces death for the crime. He tells how he had two sons, twins, and on the day they were born a poor woman also gave birth to twins. He purchased these boys as servants for his own sons. Sometime after, the family was shipwrecked, and he was separated from his wife and one of each pair of twins. His son, Antipholus, now a grown man, had recently left home with his servant Dromio to seek out his brother. When he didn't return to Syracuse, Aegean came to Ephesus to find him. The Duke is moved and gives the old man a day to find the funds to pay a fine and avoid death. Antipholus and Dromio arrive in the city the same day, and Dromio is sent off to deposit some money at their lodgings. Antipholus soon bumps into Dromio's twin, who is resident with his master in Ephesus, mistakes him for his servant, is confused when Dromio denies all knowledge of the money that he just gave him, and asks him to return home for supper with his wife. Antipholus gives Dromio a very good beating. When Dromio of Ephesus returns to his mistress, Adriana, saying her husband would not come home, she believes her suspicions about his infidelity to be proven. Antipholus of Syracuse meets up with his servant, who now denies joking about his having a wife and cannot understand why his master is beating him. Adriana runs in, begging Antipholus not to leave her. Although convinced that witchcraft must be afoot, he agrees to go with her for supper, while Dromio watches the door. At supper, Antipholus is attracted to Adriana's sister Luciana, as Dromio fends off Nell, the kitchen maid, who claims to be his fiancée. The Syracusans agree that they should leave, and while Dromio is sent back downstairs to plan, Antipholus is presented with a gold chain by the goldsmith, who insists that he ordered it. When Antipholus of Ephesus returns home, he finds Dromio of Syracuse guarding the gate and cannot understand why he is being refused entry to his own house. His companions persuade him not to make a scene, and he leaves to dine with a courtesan. After his meal, Antipholus sends his servant Dromio to fetch a rope so that he can punish Adriana. The goldsmith demands payment for the chain from him, which he denies ever receiving. He is arrested just as Dromio of Syracuse arrives, and he sends him off to Adriana for bail money. Dromio completes that mission, but gives the money to Antipholus of Syracuse by mistake. The intensity of the confusions continues to build as the courtesan tries to get hold of the gold chain. Both the Syracusans end up fleeing a crowd who seem mad to them, and while both Ephesians are arrested and taken to Adriana's house. When the Syracusans are seen in town with drawn swords, all assume that they are the Ephesians somehow escaped and try to capture them. They flee into the priory, where the abbess refuses to release them to the crowd. The Duke arrives, and under his calming influence, the twins are revealed to each other and the confusion understood. The abbess recognises her sons, their servants, and her husband Aegean. With the family reunited, the Duke pardons the merchant, and all retire to the priory to celebrate, with the two Dromios following on hand in hand. There can be no doubt that the Comedy of Errors was written as a farce, and there really is nothing too deep and meaningful to be read into it. It is the shortest of the Shakespeare comedies and includes a significant element of slapstick comedy, particularly over the frequent beating of the Dromios, but also much punning and wordplay. More farcical than the Two Gentlemen of Verona, and without the problematic elements of that play and the Taming of the Shrew, it remains for most a favourite of the early comedies. However, it does have some interesting features that are worth noting over and above the accomplishment of the farce, which builds and builds until it is resolved in a great moment of reveal right at the end of the play, just as a good farce should be. When a play opens, the tone is not immediately farcical, thanks to the long exposition that Aegean gives to explain the backstory of the two sets of twins and the disaster that beset his family. At 100 lines, it is the longest passage of exposition that Shakespeare ever needed. A fault, some say, in the young dramatist. Too much explanation, not enough action. And perhaps that is true, and we know that Shakespeare did become very adept at dramatic openings to his plays. The startling and dramatic opening scene, the ghost on the balcony, the witches at their spells, was a necessary feature in the context of the public playhouses, where the distractions of the audience were seemingly never ending. But there was nothing new there, as ever since the times of early Roman street theatre at least, the opening of a play was critical to getting the audience's attention. So perhaps we have to forgive him that opening, and that is easily done once we see how confidently the young playwright shows his mastery of farce and comic timing as he handles the interplay between the twins and those caught up in their mad orbit very well. However, we have to wait for that. With the word comedy in the title, the audience may have been quite surprised at the tone of the opening. But for that word, many may have assumed a tragedy was about to unfold. The contrast between the opening scene and the next, indeed, the contrast with the rest of the play, is quite startling. The comedy rises very quickly, just as soon as both sets of twins arrive in town. That opening speech has also been taken by some as a criticism of the way that mercantile wealth was beginning to affect the traditional hierarchies in 16th century society. The power of money, and particularly the power of wealth that was not inherited and based on land ownership, but earned through the trading activity, was undoubtedly beginning to change society, and the implicit critique of that represented in the trade wars between Syracuse and Ephesus that Aegean gets caught up in might just have been appealing to some in Shakespeare's audience. But I wonder if this is just reading too much into what is, after all, a very light comedy. However, that theme continues as Antipholus of Syracuse arrives in town and is advised by a merchant on how to protect himself and his money in the strange town. Capitalism is all. In response to this, he sends Dromio off to lodge his money, 1,000 marks. Not coincidentally, just the amount needed for Aegeon to be released. An obsession with money runs throughout the play. Dromio of Syracuse jokes about his master's focus on money. Antipholus of Ephesus is quite open about his, as is his lover the courtesan, through her obsession about gifts and the gold chain. As too is Adriana, who laments that the gold chain her husband promised her has never appeared. She then uses that sentiment to express her own position, comparing herself to gold that has lost its lustre. I see the jewel best enamelled will lose its beauty, yet the gold bides still that others touch, and often touching will wear gold. Yet no man that hath a name by falsehood and corruption doth it shame. Although we can see the play as just an exercise in Plautine comedy, some of the characters go beyond the two-dimensional representation usually found in that genre, and hint at abilities in Shakespeare that would be exploited to the full in later plays. Adriana, the lead female character in the play, is the best example of this, as she displays a complexity of character that many critics have admired. She is passionate and spirited, and undoubtedly deserving of a better husband than the one she has. We know that Antipholus consorts with courtesans, buys gifts for them, and is quick to abandon his home when he is denied entry, and takes off to the company of friends. In fact, if anything, Shakespeare toned down the nastiness of this character from Plautus's original, where he is very distastefully unpleasant to just about anybody he encounters who cannot be useful to him. Throughout, Adriana is loyal and willing to fight for her marriage. In Act 2, her lament of how she is treated by her husband is considered to be some of the best language in the play. She says, "His company must do his minions grace, while I at home strive for a merry look. Hath homely age the alluring beauty took from my poor cheek? Then he hath washed it. Are my discourses dull, barren my wit? If voluble and sharp discourse be marred, unkindness blunts it more than marble hard. Do their gay vestments his attractions bait? That's not my fault, he's master of my state. What ruins are in me that can be found by him not ruined? Then is he the ground of my defeatures. My decayed fair a sunny look of his would soon repair. But, too unruly dear, he breaks the pale and feeds from home. Poor I am, but his stale." This is much more than is needed in a farcical comedy, and it's a lovely moment of heartfelt reflection within that comedy. There is no doubt that she has our sympathies. The Antipholus brothers are nowhere near as thoughtful. Antipholus of Ephesus comes off slightly better than his brother thanks to some moments of reflection, which I'll come back to, and we can accept that his falling for Luciana is genuine, however sudden. His wooing of her provides another lyrical moment in the play amidst the chaos, and in contrast to the low comedy of his Dromio's advance to Nell the Maid. Antipholus of Syracuse says to Luciana, "Sweet mistress, what your name is else I know not, nor by what wonder do you hit of mine, less in your knowledge and your grace you show not, that our earth's wonder, more than earth divine. Teach me, dear creature, how to think and speak, lay open to my earthly gross conceit, smothered in errors, feeble, shallow, weak, the folded meaning of your words' deceit. Against my soul's pure truth why labour you, to make it wander in an unknown field? Are you a god? Would you create me new? Transform me then, and to your power I'll yield. But if that I am, I, that well I know, your weeping sister is no wife of mine, nor to her bed no homage do I owe. Far more to you I do decline. O train me not, sweet mermaid, with thy note, to drown me in thy sister's flood of tears. Sing, siren, for thyself, and I will dote. Spread o'er the silver waves thy golden hairs, and as a bed I'll take them, and there lie. And in that glorious supposition think, he gains by death that hath such means to die. Yet love, being light, be drowned if she sink." The poetry of the would-be lovers is contrasted by the prose of the Dromio twins, but their expression of feeling is no less heartfelt. In a very poignant moment, Dromio of Ephesus expounds on the life of beatings that he has suffered, again reminding us that his master really is not very nice at all. Dromio's speech is prompted by Antipholus of Ephesus saying, "Thou art sensible in nothing but blows, and so is an ass." To which Dromio of Ephesus replies, "I am an ass indeed, you may prove it by my long ears. I have served him from the hour of my nativity to this instant, and have nothing at his hands for my service but blows. When I am cold he heats me with beating, when I am warm he cools me with beating. I am waked with it when I sleep, raised with it when I sit, driven out of doors with it when I go from home, welcomed home with it when I return. Nay, I bear it on my shoulders as a beggar wont her brat, and I think, when he hath lamed me, I shall beg with it from door to door." These behaviours of the Antipholus brothers to their servants pose questions about the view of authority in the play, and the treatment of those on the lower rungs by those above. Notwithstanding the tensions between Ephesus and Syracuse, these are personal relationships. They have been forged since very early childhood. The idea that the Antipholus brothers could treat the Dromio so badly seems pretty strange to us, where we assume that there would be some sort of filial bond between them. But perhaps this was not so strange for the contemporary audience. The treatment of servants in the past is a really difficult thing to gauge, as most written evidence comes from the masters, not the servants. But it is probably safe to assume that some were treated well, while others were treated very badly. Many people will have experienced a type of servitude as they came up through the apprentice system. Again, it's difficult to judge, but some apprentices were probably treated as little more than servants, and some, no doubt, were treated badly and physically by their masters. Is the portrayal of the relationship between the Antipholus and Dromios a satiric take, or a call for masters to treat their servants better? In addition, we have to remember that we are dealing with a theatrical trope here. Comically beaten servants pepper Greek and Roman comedy, but presumably Shakespeare would not have copied the characters and their relationship so closely if they did not carry resonance for the Elizabethan theatre. As far as masters and servants go, plus ça change. To reiterate, I suggest that this is a play that we should simply sit back and enjoy and not look too deeply into full meaning or problematic plotting, but it would be remiss of me not to point out what some of these problems are. Aegeon says to the Duke that his sons could only be distinguished by their names as they were so identical, but as adults they have the same name, as do their servants. Both of these anomalies are never explained. Perhaps we are to assume that each parent could not identify which twin was in their care after the shipwreck, and by coincidence they decided to use the same name. Aegeon's retelling of the events around the shipwreck appear to be a bit confused, which we could put down to the trauma of the events, errors in an old man's memory, or fear induced by the threat of the very harsh punishment of execution. The Duke then talks about how resolute he has to be in that sentence for the errant merchant, how he cannot deviate from it, but then says that a fine can be paid, and suspends the sentence for a day in an apparent act of somewhat arbitrary clemency. Then there is Aegeon's lost wife Amelia. How does she live in the same town as one of her sons for decades, and not be aware of his presence? Perhaps her life in the priory is very cloistered, but then she is quick to give that up once her family is reunited. Perhaps the biggest hole in the plotting leaves us wondering why it does not occur to either of the Antipholus brothers, at least one of whom is actively searching for his lost brother, or to one of the Dromios, that the presence of their brother is in fact the cause of all this confusion. The point is, I think, that in the moment, while we're watching the play and watching the chaos build, these anomalies are easily ignored, if not completely forgotten. I mentioned how Adriana was one of the more fully drawn and contemplative characters, and that Antipholus of Syracuse also provides some calmer and more thoughtful moments in the play. That comes in a series of short soliloquies, and it is significant that he is the only male character in the play with such moments of self-reflection, and they are perhaps the reason why he is a more rounded character than his brother. These moments are spread quite evenly throughout the play and offer a calming moment between the bouts of confusion and an alternative view to the capitalism of Ephesus. When considering his feelings for Luciana, he offers a degree of self-reflection that emphasises what a strange effect the whole atmosphere of Ephesus has had on him, signalling himself as an outsider. There's none but witches do inhabit here, and therefore 'tis high time that I were hence. She that doth call me husband, even my soul doth for a wife abhor. But her fair sister, possessed with such a gentle sovereign grace, of such enchanting presence and discourse, hath almost made me traitor of myself. But lest myself be guilty to self-wrong, I'll stop mine eyes against that mermaid's song. But let's not mistake him for some paragon. He easily accepts the gift of dinner from a woman he does not know, being invited into the intimacy of her home, and takes the gold chain from the goldsmith without much question. Having taken those opportunities, another point where a bit of forgiveness is required of us, he then looks beyond the material and finds Luciana, a woman who expresses traditional values. Her speech to her sister on the way to run a marriage successfully could have come from the sermons that were common at the time, as could her words to Antipholus about the importance of preserving and observing customs. And may it be that you have quite forgot a husband's office? Shall Antipholus, even in the spring of love thy love springs rot? Shall love, in building, grow so ruinous? If you did wed my sister for her wealth, then for her wealth's sake use her with more kindness. Or if you like elsewhere, do it by stealth. Muffle your false love with some show of blindness. Let not my sister read it in your eyes. Be not thy tongue thy own shame's orator. Look sweet, speak fair, become disloyalty. Apparel vice like virtue's harbinger. Bear a fair presence, though your heart be tainted. Teach sin the carriage of a holy saint. Be secret false. What need she be acquainted? What simple thief brags of his own attaint? 'Tis double wrong to taunt with your bed, and let her read it in thy looks at board. Shame hath a bastard frame, well managed. Ill deeds is doubled with an evil word. Alas, poor women, make us but believe, being compact of credit, that you love us. Though others have the arm, show us thy sleeve. We in your motion turn, and you may move us. Then, gentle brother, get you in again, comfort my sister, cheer her, call her wife. 'Tis holy sport to be a little vain, when the sweet breath of flattery conquers strife. Her answer to the dangers she sees in a changing society are to rely on tradition and understood behaviours. To her mind, the solution is reconciliation and reunion, just as the play turns out in the end. This was the premise of Elizabethan comedy, and its resolution was achieved by harmony being restored in a family. But in a twist at the end of the play, we detect that things are not, perhaps, going that way. Did Shakespeare have more pessimistic thoughts when he allows Antipholus of Ephesus, ever the capitalist, to offer the Duke money for his father's release, which the Duke then refuses, and then letting Amelia give up her cloistered life to rejoin the commercial society of Ephesus? Maybe, but to me this seems to be a very severe reading. Rather, I think, at its ending, the Comedy of Errors shows us that all has returned to right in the world as the parents and sons and their ladies go into the priory to celebrate with the Duke. But rather than leaving it there, Shakespeare tags on a micro scene with just the two Dromios, the two servants, present. They cannot determine which is the older and should therefore take precedence going into the priory. Dromio of Syracuse suggests drawing lots, but his brother closes the play with a thoughtful line that feels a long way from the farcical nonsense that immediately preceded it. Nay then, thus, we came into the world like brother and brother, and now let's go hand in hand, not one before another. Farce relies on the inherent confusions of the situation growing and growing until as an audience we are in awe of how complete collapse can possibly be avoided. The Comedy of Errors, I think, fits that description and is undoubtedly a skillful piece of construction. The premise and the unfolding events in the play are inherently farcical, but as with all farce, they need to be played seriously and with precision. For such deeply running confusions, clarity from the perspective of the audience is required to follow the plot and appreciate the comedy. For me, this is Shakespeare's first really successful comedy. Following the performances in Shakespeare's lifetime, the play next surfaces in the record in 1732 and 1734, when it was performed in adapted versions. The original was then performed at the Drury Lane Theatre in 1741, and it ran for 5 performances. This may not sound like much to us, but at the time, plays were only presented for very short runs, and it is probable that this was considered a success at the time. Apart from many regular productions since then, the play has been a popular one for adaptation, perhaps most successfully in the 1938 Rodgers and Hart musical The Boys from Syracuse. Several versions of the original play are also available on DVD from the RSC, from Shakespeare's Globe, and from the BBC, the latter having some added interest with Roger Daltrey playing the Dromios, making those final words of the play particularly challenging. Next time, we will be leaving Shakespeare for a while as I introduce his contemporary, sometime friend and maybe rival into the story. Ben Jonson was a very different character from Shakespeare, and his works were hugely popular in his day. Fortunately, we know a little more about his life than we do of Shakespeare's, which gives us a chance to understand him and to get to know him in a way that we can't quite do for his friend and rival. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group or find the podcast on Instagram or X just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. You can find details of ways to support the podcast at the website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. That's also a great place to get in touch with me if you wish by using the contact form, or you could even leave me a voicemail by clicking on the microphone icon. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can also contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.